So let's get this party started. On behalf of Marines past, present, and future, welcome to the National Museum of the Marine Corps and tonight's lecture. I'm Kyle Gentry. I'm the director here at the museum, and it's my honor to introduce the guest speaker for this evening. I'm not sure he's really a guest since he works here, but anyway, works over there. But this is the second lecture in a 7-lecture series that commemorates 250 years of the Marine Corps, and really it's meant to define or explain who we are as a naval expeditionary combined armed force with a heavy emphasis on small unit leadership and whatnot. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Shawn Callahan. He is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, graduated in 1992. He then became a weapons and sensors officer in the F/A-18D. His last assignment in the Marine Corps was at the Command Staff College as part of the faculty there. And then when he retired, he worked for 9 years as a course director at the College of Distance Education and Training. Not satisfied with just the day job, he was also studying for his PhD at night and received his PhD from the University of Maryland, and he assumed his current duties as the director of the History Division in January of 2024. His lecture tonight is going to be on the origins of the Marine Corps as a naval expeditionary force. And the title of the lecture is "The Marine Corps is Defined by its 250-Year Relationship with the United States Navy." Tonight's lecture is going to be recorded, and then we'll later post it on the museum's website. And what's really neat is the speakers you see behind me, these are all experts in their subjects, and their talks will then become the subject matter for chapters that will be part of a book that's going to be published in 2027. So with that, I would ask that you hold all your questions till the designated time at the end of the lecture. And with no further ado, I welcome Dr. Shawn Callahan.
Thank you, Kyle. I also want to thank everybody for braving the bitterly cold temperatures to come out this evening. It's great to see so many people passionate about our history, but also among you, so many colleagues, friends, and as it turns out, family as well. So thank you for being here. Before I begin, I also must say that what I'm about to present to you is my personal interpretation of Marine Corps history as a scholar. So this does not reflect the official history as defined by History Division, the Marine Corps, or any other federal entity. This is my own personal interpretation. There's no single aspect of Marine Corps history which has defined the Corps more deeply over the last 250 years than its relationship with the U.S. Navy. Marine Corps roles and missions throughout this period have always been a product of the Corps' relationship with the Navy, and the way Marines understood themselves was very much a reflection of their relationship with the Navy and its sailors. To understand how this 250-year relationship shaped the Corps and its Marines, it's useful to think of this long span of time in 5 distinct periods. First and longest, lasting through the entire first half of the Corps' existence, was an era of subordination from 1775 to 1900, a period in which the Corps was, with a few rare exceptions, completely dependent upon and subservient to the needs of the Navy. This began to change in the period from 1900 to 1933, a time of great turmoil in the relationship between the services, driven by a number of factors, ultimately establishing the Corps as the Navy's expeditionary force provider and with a more independent identity. The next 15 years, from 1933 to 1948, were defined by the Fleet Marine Force as a Navy type command, so to speak, a close operational and strategic alignment between the sea services. The 50-year period which followed from 1948 to 1998 was an awakening for the Marine Corps, learning to promote its own interests as a service, emerging as a full partner of the U.S. Navy, and becoming an expeditionary force provider with strategic relevance beyond the needs of the Navy. The final era, from 1998 to the present, is the mature stage of this relationship, with the Marine Corps and Navy acting as joint partners, bonded by their naval heritage and maritime orientation, which is most evident in their preparations for future conflicts. While telling this story, we'll explain why the Marine Corps is fundamentally naval in character, rather than merely being a second land army, and also shows how the Corps' long relationship with the Navy has defined its self-identity. Another theme emerges. This narrative will show the Corps' maturation as a service in partnership with the Navy was paralleled by its growth into an expeditionary force in readiness. This is an equally definitive characteristic of the Marine Corps of today and did not happen overnight. It is instead a product of 250 years' experience, from the time when Marines filled narrow tactical purposes as part of ships' crews, to the emergence of the Corps as an expeditionary maneuver element for the Navy, to its current identity as the nation's expeditionary force in readiness, a true national strategic asset. The story, of course, begins with the establishment of the Continental Navy and Marines in the fall of 1775, for the origins of these two organizations 250 years ago are intertwined. As the American Navy was first authorized in October of that year to contest the control of the world's greatest sea power, it drew from the model of that very same adversary, which regarded its Royal Marines as essential components of a ship's crew. The resolution of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia on November 10, 1775, to establish 2 battalions of American Marines so acquainted with maritime affairs as to be able to serve to advantage by sea, is celebrated as the birth of today's Marine Corps. But this implies a much higher degree of organization than existed in these early years. While the seaport of Philadelphia did serve as a focal area for recruiting, those 2 battalions were never raised. Instead, most Marines were recruited directly into the crews of the ships of the Continental Navy, as shown by this advertisement placed by Marine Captain William Jones of the ship Providence in Boston, seeking immediately a few good men to make up her complement. The Continental Marines served in the same 3 roles aboard ship as the Royal Marines. First, they were a guard force providing internal security, including against the threat of mutiny. Second, they provided small arms fire from the fighting tops in combat and participated in boarding parties. Third, they participated in landing operations, but when they did go ashore, it was almost always in landing parties, which contained large percentages of sailors, as seen here in this depiction of the landing at New Providence in March 1776. Near the end of 1777, however, General Washington was on the defensive near Philadelphia, and the Marines there were called to assist. Major Samuel Nicholas combined those on hand into a small battalion, really more of a modern company, and participated in Washington's short winter campaign along the Delaware River. Thus, it was shown that, when called upon, Marines were prepared to serve in operations ashore far from the Navy they were really meant to be an integral part of. This was the very start of the dual life of the Marine Corps, an essential part of the Department of the Navy, which has often served the nation by augmenting the Army in sustained campaigns ashore. Throughout my remaining discussion, I will describe such sustained and major deployments ashore as expeditionary operations to distinguish them from the Marines' traditional shipboard roles. Though the Continental Navy, and along with it the Continental Marines, ceased to exist after the end of the war in Britain, when the first moves were made to resurrect a standing Navy, Marines were considered a natural and essential component. In 1794, an act to provide a naval armament authorized the construction of 6 frigates and the recruitment of crews, including a complement of Marines for each vessel. It wasn't until a looming naval war with France in 1798 that these efforts were completed, and when the next Marines were recruited, it was by Navy authorities and specifically into the crews of these ships. Here we see the commission of Franklin Wharton, who just 6 years later would become Commandant of the Marine Corps. In 1798, he was appointed a Lieutenant of Marines in the Navy of the United States to serve aboard a specific frigate. This condition of a Marine simply being a type of crew member in the Navy did not last long, however, as Congress saw the need for a distinct organization to provide Marines for this type of duty. The Act for Establishing and Organizing a Marine Corps, enacted on July 11, 1798, is the true birthday of the U.S. Marine Corps, but these were still humble beginnings. The Commandant had only a small personal staff and was almost exclusively devoted to providing Marines to serve aboard the ships of the U.S. Navy and to garrison the Marine barracks, which served as both the Corps' shore establishment and security for Navy yards. While integral to a ship's crew, Marines were organized into what was known as the Guard of each vessel, its guard force under the command of a Marine officer, or in the case of smaller vessels, a senior sergeant known as an orderly sergeant. On only very rare occasions did Marines undertake activities independent from the Navy. One such example is the expedition to Tripoli by Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon and a small squad of Marines in 1805. This overland journey and subsequent attack on Derna was a modest venture, especially when it was cut short by a political deal halfway to the final objective. To the Marines of the 19th century, however, this expedition was symbolically important. It was one of the rare events they could point to as a specifically Marine accomplishment, and they commemorated it by having to the shores of Tripoli emblazoned on the Marine colors. This shows the value the Commandant and his tiny staff, established in Washington, D.C. at 8th and I, just 3 years earlier, began to provide as a service headquarters. While his Marines are spread across the Navy's ships and yards, there was someone entrusted with considering and promoting their collective interests, be it in recruitment standards, uniforming and equipping, or even bearing the first and only Marine Corps colors that existed at the time. The vast majority of Marines were dispersed in small units living cramped shipboard lives, and there was a friction between Marines and sailors. In daily life, the Marines of a ship's guard were a force for order, charged with preserving discipline. Wearing distinct uniforms and having separate roles, they essentially constituted what could be thought of as an other within. And while this began to foster a separate identity from sailors, there was no real sense these men were a better breed. Indeed, in daily life, with Marines posted as sentries, but not contributing to the work of the ship itself, many sailors considered their Marine shipmates to be lazy freeloaders. Policy ratified the notion that Marines were worth less than sailors, literally, for since the American Revolution, Marine privates were the lowest paid members of any crew, and their sergeants earned only as much as an ordinary seaman. Relations between Navy and Marine officers were notoriously bad during this era, exacerbated by unclear policy that left one man's opinion as good as any other. In 1833, the Board of Navy Commissioners circumscribed the authority of Marine officers by redrafting Navy regulations, prohibiting Marines from commanding vessels and putting the Marine barracks under the command of the yard commandants, Navy officers. These regulations also established that Marine officers were junior to all Navy officers of the same grade, regardless of their dates of commission. While this latter point was corrected by Congress a year later in an act for the better organization of the United States Marine Corps, the most interesting provision of the 1833 Navy regulations lay in one specific authority they did grant to Marine officers. While they prohibited a Marine from assuming command of a Navy officer of any grade, there was one important exception, when involved in a landing party. This stipulation marks an important milestone in Navy and Marine Corps relations. It was a formal recognition among the Navy's most senior officers that the Marines did, in fact, have an important competency. While over the next century, landing operations were almost always conducted by combined parties of sailors and Marines under the command of a Navy officer, the functional expertise of Marines as soldiers of the sea was being recognized, and this competency conveyed a degree of authority. Under the leadership of Colonel Commandant Archibald Henderson from 1820 to 1859, the Corps showed unusual independence for the Navy for this era. Henderson was aware that the Corps occupied a liminal space between the Army and Navy that attracted the interest of cost-conscious political leaders. Among other things, Henderson aggressively pursued opportunities for the Corps to demonstrate its value by doing things beyond its minor subordinate role to the Navy. In 1836, Henderson formed half the strength of the Corps into a 2-battalion regiment under his personal command and deployed it for service under Army leadership in the Creek and Seminole Wars. In the Mexican War, Henderson again scoured the Navy yards to build a battalion, which was eventually employed by General Winfield Scott in Mexico City. While the Navy played an important but less glorious supporting role in this war, the Marines took great pride in being part of the Army's deep inland expedition. Henderson commemorated it by adding to the halls of the Montezumas to the Corps' colors. It is important to remember, however, that as much as Marines celebrated such events, they were indeed rare. Far more typical was mundane day in and day out life at sea or in the barracks of a Navy yard. Now, the Civil War challenged the 8 decades of convention that had governed Navy and Marine Corps relations before that point. The small antebellum U.S. Navy required a massive expansion to blockade the lengthy Confederate coastline, and the Navy had difficulty recruiting enough sailors for the task. As a result, Marines were often called to form crews to operate the great guns of a ship, as in this famous depiction of Admiral Farragut's attack into Mobile Bay. While the routine operation of the ship remained sailors' work, Marines were sometimes also called to assist with rigging sails and fueling their ships. By this time, the threat of mutiny had significantly diminished, and in this more utilitarian fleet, Marines often intermixed with sailors in their shirt sleeves. Yet accounts show Marines adopting a competitive identity within a crew, taking pride in comparing their gunnery performance with that of the sailors, and especially their superiority with muskets. While the Marines' role in this war was very much as an integrated part of a ship's crew, the war also provided an opportunity to explore a new mission. A battalion was formed to provide the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron with an expeditionary force to help the Navy seize and occupy ports along the Confederate coast. Although the Marine Corps was quick to assemble Marines for this purpose, the experiment failed due to the battalion not being furnished with adequate shipping, proper field equipment, or timely orders. More typical was the traditional method of forming landing forces composed of both sailors and Marines from ships' crews. In the two boldest ventures, the September 1863 assault on Fort Sumter and the January 1865 assault on Fort Fisher, Marines made up a quarter or less of the landing forces. In the decades after the Civil War, little changed in naval doctrine or practice regarding the employment of Marines aboard ships, even as the Navy slowly evolved into a more modern fleet of steam and steel warships. By 1885, Navy officers recognized that vessels outfitted with steam propulsion, electrical systems, and longer-range heavy-caliber guns were, in their words, instruments of precision, which required a more intelligent and highly trained technical breed of sailor. While the officers debated various measures needed to recruit and retain the right kinds of sailors, they criticized Marines for a want of adaptability in their system of training to nautical conditions and modern weapons. It was not for a lack of effort, for in 1871, Commandant Brigadier General Jacob Zeeland had established a sea school at the Marine Barracks in Portsmouth. Its objective was to ensure every Marine was properly trained in shipboard duties before being sent abroad from barracks duty, a system that continued for more than another century, with a second sea school established in San Diego to support the Pacific Fleet. Despite these efforts, in the 1880s, some ship's guards continued to organize sharpshooter groups for combat, a practice that continued to the end of the century. In the Battle of Manila Bay in 1898, the ship's log of the Olympia recorded that Marines expended several hundred rounds of small arms ammunition, even though the two fleets never approached closer than about a nautical mile. And this painting by John J. Capolino shows the battle off Santiago, Cuba, 2 months later. And it clearly depicts a Marine officer in the fighting tops of the battleship Texas directing the fire of what appears to be 1-pound Hotchkiss guns, adopted for anti-torpedo boat defense. Despite the lack of Spanish torpedo boats off Santiago, these Marines are not going to miss a chance to be a part of the action if there's an enemy cruiser to shoot at, as little damage as they can expect that their gun might inflict. The point here is that while a radical technological change was revolutionizing the way Navy ships were operated and fought, Marines of the ship's guards were still in combat roles which closely resembled those of a century past. The Marines' continued affinity for small arms in naval combat may have been a reflection of the increasingly important role they had begun assuming in landing operations, promoted by their discipline, marksmanship skills, and expertise in soldiering. In 1874, Secretary of the Navy George Robeson decreed, when companies of seamen and Marines are united for battalion drill or infantry service afloat or ashore, the Marine Company will take the right of the line. This was the traditional position of honor where a commander would place his most effective troops in a line of battle. While the Marines of this era could not make broad claims of qualitative superiority over sailors, as soldiers of the sea, they were recognized and affirmed in doctrine as the most competent infantrymen within any crew. And occasionally, when expeditionary demands exceeded the capacity of a squadron's ad hoc landing force, the Marine Corps hastily assembled and deployed larger forces, just as it had done for the Creek and Seminole Wars and the war with Mexico. The most prominent of these in the last half of the 19th century was the Marine Brigade formed to help stabilize the Isthmus of Panama in 1885. Marines since that time have been fond of Richard Harding Davis's famous quote about the arrival of this brigade, writing, "The Marines have landed and the situation is well in hand." But it was, as was so often the case, part of a naval task force under the command of a Navy officer and included large numbers of sailors. Again, these were exceptions to the usual mode of employment. For its first 123 years, the Marine Corps was almost exclusively focused on sourcing a collection of platoon-sized guard forces for the vessels and yards of the Navy. On only 7 occasions in these first 123 years of Marine Corps history were battalion-sized organizations deliberately formed, and these were only temporary units made for special purposes and usually lasting only 2 or 3 months. Some Navy and Marine officers saw greater opportunity for the Corps in such expeditionary operations, arguing the Commandant should create a standing force ashore to provide battalions for large landing forces and expeditionary deployments. A few Navy officers even argued for a complete abolishment of the ship's guard mission, such as Lieutenant William Freeland Fulham in an 1894 Naval Institute Proceedings paper stating, "The Marines would make more of a contribution were they removed from the combatant ships and organized as 6 ready expeditionary battalions to support the fleet or U.S. and foreign policy as needed." Now, the Spanish-American War soon demonstrated the need for these types of expeditionary forces. After the victory over the Spanish squadron off Manila, Admiral Dewey was able to land the Marines from his ships to secure the naval base nearby, but estimated it would have required a force of 4,000 or 5,000 Marines to secure his ultimate objective, Manila. This left him dependent on Army troops, which did not start arriving from the United States until a month later, and took yet another month to build up enough strength to deal with a situation that had grown worse for the waiting. Meanwhile, to support a close blockade off Santiago, Admiral Sampson resolved to seize nearby Guantanamo Bay for coaling operations. He could not afford to give up crews from the blockade to secure the bay and protect it from a counterattack by Spanish forces. So once again, the Corps scrambled to cobble together a single Marine battalion and deploy it to the fleet. Despite the numerous hard-learned lessons to be expected in undertaking such a novel operation, the ultimate success of this pickup battalion serving the Navy as an expeditionary force suggested a new role for the Corps in the future. What caused the greatest change for the Marine Corps in its relationship with the Navy came from the top down as a result of new strategic demands at the turn of the century. The Navy understood it was entering an era where it would require a global presence and would therefore need distant coaling stations to sustain its reach. In 1900, the General Board of the Navy, a panel of senior admirals to consider strategy, recommended that the Marine Corps be tasked with a new mission, providing an expeditionary force prepared to land and protect suitable harbors to serve as distant advance bases for the U.S. fleet. Commandant Major General Charles Haywood accepted the mission and established an advanced base force battalion in Philadelphia in 1901. Even as this new organization was being created, the Navy and Marine Corps were exploring other options for employing Marines. Admiral Dewey's need for a ready expeditionary force after the Battle of Manila Bay and the performance of the 1st Marine Battalion at Guantanamo suggested the value of sustaining forward-deployed expeditionary forces afloat, ready to respond more quickly than a large advanced base force deployed from the United States. This concept became known as the Floating Battalion, and in 1902, the Navy provided USS Panther as the dedicated transport for this unit. This was a significant milestone, as after more than a century of trying to meet expeditionary emergencies with the crews of ships or hastily assembled Marine units from the U.S., it represented the establishment of a new capability, an afloat expeditionary reaction force that could be considered a direct ancestor of today's Marine Expeditionary Unit. Over the course of 2 years, the Corps formed 4 different floating battalions at one time or another. Both the Navy and the Marine Corps learned from this experience. A major friction point revolved around the authority of a ship's captain, which had previously been supreme over his Marines, both while embarked and while ashore. After more than a century, when the function of Marines was only to support a vessel, some captains struggled to adapt to the idea that the primary function of their ships would now be to support their Marines, and Marine commanders needed to be given latitude to train and operate ashore effectively. Neither the Advanced Base Force nor the floating battalion concept lasted long, however, due to other operational demands. Marines of the Asiatic Fleet were needed to augment the U.S. Army in the Philippines, and after some were diverted to China for the Boxer Rebellion, more were deployed from the United States. Over the succeeding years, the Corps was also ordered to provide forces for operations in Panama, Cuba, and Nicaragua, sustaining all 4 interventions simultaneously. For the first decade of the 20th century, this left no manpower for building an advanced base force or sustaining a floating battalion unless Marines were taken from the traditional role manning ship's guards. And there is no evidence that the Commandant seriously considered abandoning this traditional mission. It was a logical choice since service aboard the ships of the U.S. Navy had been central to the identity and purpose of the Corps from the start, but it did leave the Corps vulnerable. Reform-minded Navy officers like Fulham were in a stronger position to advance their agenda when one of their most influential advocates, Theodore Roosevelt, became president in 1901. Eventually, Roosevelt was persuaded by the reformers' argument that Marines were more of a detriment to a ship's crew than an asset, and needed to be redirected towards the advanced base mission. On November 12, 1908, the President signed Executive Order 969, defining a revised mission set for the Marine Corps, and it no longer included the ship's guard function. The Navy swiftly issued orders for the withdrawal of Marines from the crews of its ships. From the Marine Corps' perspective, the disbandment of the ship's guards was an existential threat, occurring almost simultaneously with an Army effort to absorb the Marine Corps into its ranks. If Marines were removed from ships, most of what they would be left doing in Cuba, Panama, and the Philippines looked like Army work, and whenever Marines lacked clearly defined and unique roles, it left the Corps vulnerable to abolishment or absorption. Fortunately, in the crisis of 1908, the Corps benefited from the support of Congressman Thomas S. Butler, father of Major Smedley Butler, who was already emerging as a legend within the Corps for his combat leadership. Congressman Butler spearheaded an effort to bring the matter into open debate in hearings and to include language in a naval appropriations bill, which stipulated that 8% of the enlisted crew of all battleships and armored cruisers should be Marines. When this forced the Navy to reinstate the ship's guards, the naval reformers reacted with increased criticism of the Corps for its neglect of the advanced base mission. Marines had to begin taking that mission more seriously to both appease these critics and secure a unique strategic role for the Corps. In 1910, the Commandant began to take action to establish the Advanced Base Force. By 1913, the Corps had formed a full advanced brigade with 2 complementary regiments, which exercised with the fleet at Calabria in 1914. When a crisis arose in Mexico shortly afterwards, the brigade was quickly redeployed with the fleet to Veracruz, where it demonstrated real value as a flexible, ready response force. There, the Marine battalions of the Advanced Base Brigade also proved better prepared for hostilities ashore than the sailors' battalions formed from the ship's crews in the traditional pick-up manner. There would be decades before the Navy doctrine finally abandoned this technique of forming ad hoc landing parties. Momentum was growing for the Corps to become the Navy's designated expeditionary force. This series of events occurred in a period which may be regarded as the birth of the modern Marine Corps for several reasons. First, this ended the era when the primary and sole justification for the existence of the Marine Corps was to provide ship's guards for the vessels of the fleet, and began an era of finding new roles to deliver unique strategic value. Second, in this time, the Corps was also fundamentally reshaping itself from a dispersed collection of shipboard and Navy Yard guard forces to add standing infantry units. Over the next decade, the Marine Corps established standing battalions, regiments, and brigades to meet constant expeditionary demands. Another reason this period signifies the birth of the modern Marine Corps is it marks the beginning of a truly separate identity from the Navy that included a sense of qualitative difference between Marines and sailors. This began with the Corps' response to the difficulty of recruiting in competition with the Army and Navy. Recruiters began to cultivate a distinct image to make it clear how a Marine was different from a soldier and a sailor, in effect emphasizing that Marines fulfilled both roles. The idea of a multi-purpose serviceman, one who could do the job of two, naturally carried the implication that Marines were better than sailors or soldiers, a qualitative difference captured in the brand Soldiers of the Sea. Another key component of Marine Corps branding for recruiting in this era was the slogan, "First to Fight." Subsequently, the ability of the Marine Corps to recruit more selectively and maintain high standards, then deliver an impressive performance in France in World War I, became the foundation to the elite culture of the modern Marine Corps. It is important to note, however, that if this notion of eliteness started with the imagery of soldiers of the sea who were first to fight, both of those claims depended directly on the Marine Corps' relationship with the Navy. It was Marines' participation in naval landing forces that provided them with opportunities to serve as soldiers on land as well as sea, and it was their forward deployment on the ships of the fleet that got Marines to various emergencies before the Army. By the 1920s, the notion of the Marine Corps being an elite military service was well entrenched and was being regenerated through the service's self-conception. In 1929, the Commandant approved 3 verses as the official words of the Marines' hymn, and they made an explicit claim of superiority over the other services, ending the final verse with, "If the Army and the Navy ever look on heaven's scenes, they will find the streets are guarded by the United States Marines." Notice another distinction here. In learning the newly approved version of their service song, Marines were teaching themselves not that they were a natural part of the Navy, but separate from and better than the Navy. What we see occurring starting by the second decade of the 20th century, then, is the Marine Corps starting to foster its identity as a distinct and better military service, rather than merely a subordinate adjunct to the Navy. While remarking on these cultural matters, it's important to keep the larger and broader picture of the service's employment in mind. Expeditionary commitments in Central America and the Caribbean remain consistently high, so that in 1921, Commandant Major General John Archer Lejeune reorganized the Advanced Base Forces standing regiments into 2 brigade-sized response forces, a West Coast Expeditionary Force and an East Coast Expeditionary Force. It should be remembered, though, that these standing expeditionary forces were almost always deployed under the leadership of the Navy officer in command of a fleet or squadron. Their operations were also often in concert with groups of Marines drawn from the ships of the fleet. While we often think of this era in Marine Corps history as one typified by the small wars adventures of Chesty Puller, Merritt Edson, and Christian Schild, which had little to do with the Navy, much of the Corps' manpower remained devoted to the ship's guards, and these expeditionary deployments were really in concert with and part of fleet operations in support of U.S. foreign policy. Indeed, while about 2 brigades worth of Marines remained deployed to places like Haiti, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and China, throughout this entire period of changing operational demands from 1900 to 1933, about a brigade's worth of Marines remained aboard ships in the traditional role, in what were now referred to as Marine detachments, or MARDETs for short. The Corps' leaders believed the traditional mission of providing Marines to the ships of the fleet was necessary to their expeditionary partnership. General Lejeune, reflecting back on the evolving roles of Marines and their relationship with the Navy during this period, wrote, "Service afloat is necessary in order to provide the Navy with an efficient expeditionary force habituated to ship life. Duty on board the combat ships of the fleet is not only the best, but is practically the only means by which these eminently desirable results can be attained." General Lejeune was no simple conservative, however, for even while reorganizing the Corps' muscle for small wars, he kept its head in naval affairs in a visionary way. The most important manifestation of this was Lieutenant Colonel Earl Ellis's 1921 study of a future war with Japan Operations Plan 712, Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. This concluded that in such a war, the Japanese could be expected to seize and defend many of the same bases the U.S. would need. To counter this, the American fleet would need an offensive amphibious force to seize them, and the plan called for half of the Corps' deployable manpower to be devoted to that effort. The next area is distinguished by the Marine Corps assuming greater responsibility for the Expeditionary Force mission from the Navy, but in a form more closely tied to Corps naval missions. In essence, starting in 1933, the Marines were not merely part of Naval Expeditionary Forces, they were the Navy's Expeditionary Force, specifically the Fleet Marine Force designed to prosecute amphibious assaults and campaigns. The expeditionary demands of the small wars were drastically reduced due to a turn in U.S. foreign policy in 1932, allowing the Marine Corps to begin building the amphibious assault capability proposed 11 years earlier. An important milestone in this effort was the repurposing of the two expeditionary forces into the Fleet Marine Force in December 1933, so that the Corps was almost exclusively manning, training, and equipping Marines for employment by the Chief of Naval Operations in support of fleet needs. It is useful to think of the newly formed Fleet Marine Force as a type command within the Navy structure, placing it on a similar footing with the battle fleets, carrier forces, and submarine forces. Each a subordinate element of the fleet responsible for unique missions contributing to the larger objective, sea control. As such, the Marines became the Sea Service's thought leaders for the development of amphibious doctrine and for envisioning and testing new requirements to generate needed capabilities. The fleet landing exercises conducted as part of the Navy's fleet problems every year from 1935 to 1941 exercised the former expeditionary forces in their new role as Fleet Marine Forces. More and more Marines in both air and ground units were intimately involved in making the ideas in Operations Plan 712 and the tentative manual for landing operations a reality. When on February 1st, 1941, the Marine Corps expanded the two brigades of the FMF into the 1st Marine Division and the 2nd Marine Division, it was to provide amphibious muscle to a growing fleet which expected to face a formidable enemy, and soon would. The course of the Pacific War showed that the Navy and Marine Corps still had much to learn about amphibious operations, and tensions between them persisted, most often related to the length and effectiveness of pre-assault bombardments. It is noteworthy, however, that these disputes led to even closer integration, and no amphibious operation failed, even when facing the most formidable Japanese defenses in places like Tarawa and Iwo Jima. FMF leaders understood their place in the larger scheme of Pacific strategy. While the Navy was tasked with supporting Marine forces and landing operations, these amphibious operations were in turn supporting the broader strategy to project naval power across the Pacific. The Navy was correspondingly content to recognize the supremacy of the FMF in this role, and Marines as the experts within the naval services for executing the landing force mission. The fleet no longer attempted to mount out ad hoc landing forces composed of sailors and Marines from ships' crews, even if they retained this option in doctrine for more than a decade after this war ended. Having the FMF as a type command of sorts enabled the capital ships to abandon such distractions from their most important mission, fighting air and sea battles to gain sea control. Although the FMF was the Corps' priority of effort in World War II, significant support of the Marine detachments in their traditional shipboard roles continued. Notice that the baseline throughout the preceding 40-year period of organizational turbulence for the Corps was the mission to provide Marines to serve on the crews of capital ships. This was a substantial commitment never really questioned by the Marine Corps and continued through all of World War II. Even when the Corps struggled to man the 4th, 5th, and 6th Marine Divisions, at the peak of this manpower crisis in December 1943, the Corps still assigned about 7,000 Marines to shipboard duty aboard the battleships, cruisers, and carriers of the Pacific and Atlantic fleets. The Navy still considered the Marine detachments important to the efficient functioning of these vessels and continued to employ Marines operating their secondary weapon systems, This increasingly meant 20-millimeter anti-aircraft batteries. In many respects, then, it would seem that the Navy and Marine Corps had arrived at a happy marriage born in the crucible of combat. While the traditional missions the Maraudets inherited from the ship's guards continued, the FMF provided the fleet with a critical operational capability in a subordinate role to the Navy. For the Marines, the FMF provided a degree of distinction from the Army, even while fighting alongside soldiers in the Pacific, and victories in costly amphibious operations reinforced the elite image of the Corps. Within higher commands, however, there were signs of discontent. Most significant to the future of the Navy-Marine Corps relationship was Admiral Nimitz's decision to put the landing forces for the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific Theater, the invasion of Okinawa, under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., who led the 10th Army. Marine Lieutenant General Howland Mad Smith wanted his FMF pack to have that job. For Admiral Nimitz, though, the need to preserve inter-service harmony with the Army took precedence over appeasing his interdepartmental subordinate partner, the Marine Corps. Marine leaders saw a lesson in this. Full subordination to the Navy, even after the Corps had developed a unique and essential place in the Navy's warfighting organization, did not mean the Corps' interests would always be protected by their senior partner. And the Marines who saw it this way would be the very same men who guided the Corps into its next era of its relationship with the U.S. Navy. The events that precipitated a redefinition of the Navy-Marine Corps relationship from 1948 to 1998 were victory in World War II and the dawn of the nuclear age. Defense unification advocates sought to reorganize the services in a single military department with a newly established independent Air Force, and Army leaders saw this as an opportunity to try and absorb the Corps once again. Air power advocates argued long-range bombers made aircraft carriers unnecessary, and the July 1946 Bikini Atoll atomic weapons tests showed the vulnerability of concentrated fleets and amphibious task forces. In practical terms, the unification program seemed to favor nuclear strike forces at the expense of conventional forces, and especially sea power. The U.S. Navy's focus was on preserving its own air arm and developing nuclear capabilities, which it saw as critical to its relevance in the Cold War. The CNO accomplished this in the Key West Agreements of March 1948, but Marines, noting that their commandant had not been included in the meetings, believed the Navy's wins came at the expense of the Marine Corps by confining it to the amphibious role, even as many people questioned if amphibious operations would be possible in the future. This was considered a betrayal and signaled that the Marine Corps was ultimately on its own. The Corps survived the challenge by thinking and acting like an independent service, acting in its own self-interests. And this time, it did it in a more overt way than ever before. Marine leaders leveraged the Corps' wartime record of accomplishments and high reputation with the American public to secure the political influence necessary to preserve a minimum force structure in Public Law 416 of June 1952. This also included a provision that when the Joint Chiefs of Staff discussed a matter of direct concern to the Marine Corps, the Commandant would be included in deliberations and have an equal voice with the other members. Over time, Marines worked with congressional advocates to secure greater voice for the Corps. In 1978, legislation granted the Commandant equal standing with the other service chiefs in the JCS. This accomplishment took 26 years, in part because it depended on the Corps demonstrating it had a distinct contribution from the Navy, which deserved an independent voice in national military decision-making. The value that the Marine Corps began to demonstrate over the intervening decades was providing rapidly deployable, task-organized forces of ground and air units. In 1948, the Corps began to sustain a forward-deployed infantry battalion in the Mediterranean Fleet. But in 1954, Commandant General Lemuel C. Shepard, Jr. argued the need for air-ground task forces able to react to a wider range of Cold War contingencies. The concept was enhanced by adding scalability, and after a decade of debate and refinement, in December 1962, it was formalized as the Marine Air Ground Task Force, or MAGTF. This was a unique capability which was associated with the Navy, but not solely tied to it or dependent on the Navy's vision. In the 63 years since its inception, the MAGTF has become the Marine Corps' major contribution to national defense. Throughout the Cold War, this multi-mission, flexible MAGTF structure, combined with a rapidly deployable expeditionary capability, served the nation well, from keeping Marine expeditionary units afloat in trouble spots around the world to contributing Marine expeditionary forces alongside the Army in major conflicts ashore. The emergence of the MAGTF as the centerpiece of Marine Corps operational doctrine provided much greater organizational freedom of action for the Corps than it had under the FMF concept of the 1930s and 1940s. In many respects, it gave Marines the best of both worlds. On the one hand, the Corps could maintain a close relationship with the Navy, branding itself as an inherently amphibious force. This helped disarm criticisms that the Corps was merely a second land army. On the other hand, the Marine Corps could serve ashore in sustained warfare, as happened in the Korean War and Vietnam. In such cases, the Marine Corps operated under joint command and essentially emerged as a joint force provider in its own right. The MAGTF was a massive organizational change for the Marine Corps. Though deployable Marine units were still referred to as the Fleet Marine Force, they were no longer solely devoted to supporting fleet missions. What was equally significant to the Corps, however, was the gradual atrophy of the traditional shipboard role and eventual elimination of the Marine detachments. Since MAGTFs eliminated the need for ships' crews to mount ad hoc landing parties, and gun batteries began to disappear in the missile-age fleet, the Mardettes served only a limited security function and in ceremonial roles. The question from a century earlier arose again. Did a modern Navy really need Marines aboard its ships? At first, there was no question about maintaining this commitment as an essential component of the Navy Marine Corps team. Throughout the first 4 decades of the Cold War, the Corps understood the importance of putting its best foot forward when selecting Marines for a Mardette. And Marines saw this as a desirable special duty assignment. Marines also saw this as an important connection to their past. Annual articles appearing in Leatherneck magazine alerted Marines to opportunities for sea duty and routinely began with descriptions of shipboard service as a connection to the early days of the Continental Marines. In 1952, one asserted, "Nowhere in the Corps is tradition richer or more zealously observed than in a Marine compartment aboard an American warship." Ironically, while sea duty aboard a battleship, cruiser, or carrier was considered an important tie to the soul of the Corps, such romantic statements were also tacit admission that the Mardettes were anachronistic. Over time, the Navy's demand signal for Marines in these traditional shipboard roles continued to attenuate, most significantly after the advent of the Aegis combat system redefined cruisers as fleet air defense missile platforms. Marine detachments continued to serve only on the crews of battleships, carriers, and submarine tenders, fulfilling some of their traditional roles and protecting nuclear resources. As the number of ships requiring these services dwindled, so did the number of Marines involved in these missions, and the cultural importance of sea duty to the Marine Corps along with it. In 1987, only 24 vessels still included Marine detachments, and in December of that year, the last of the 2 sea schools closed. Service in a Mardette came to be regarded as one more distinguishing feature of the old Corps, a distant romantic past. In 1987, one Leatherneck writer observed of the shift in emphasis from traditional sea duty to MAGTF, "There was a time when all Marines were considered soldiers of the sea. Now most Marines can be considered soldiers from the sea." With the MAGTF now an essential component of the joint force, the Marine Corps no longer depended on the Mardettes as a unique connection to the Navy to justify its existence, despite being a tie the Corps had maintained continuously for 200 years. In 1996, Commandant General Charles Krulak made the decision to reclaim the manpower in the Mardettes, and the final Marine detachment aboard a ship of the U.S. Navy was disestablished in 1998. The Cold War had ended with the quiet disappearance of the U.S. Navy's pacing threat 9 years earlier and led to a period of strategic aimlessness. As the Secretary of the Navy sought a new defining concept, General Krulak represented the Corps in the effort and provided a vision where the Navy lacked one. The jointly published white paper, From the Sea, placed so much emphasis on power projection through the littorals that many felt the Navy had abdicated its strategic leadership within the Department of the Navy. Though the concept was quickly revised to put emphasis on sea control as an enabling feature for littoral operations, the moment was significant because it also marked the growth of Marine Corps generalship as a true strategic commodity. In an era of jointness, Marines continued to emerge as joint leaders on their own merits. Unthinkable in World War II, when Marine generals were always subordinate to an admiral, as the Cold War drew to a close, Marines began serving as joint force commanders with increasing frequency. Since then, two have even served as chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In summary, the 50-year period between 1948 and 1998 was an era of maturation for the Marine Corps as a service, learning to advocate for itself and develop unique contributions to the joint force in concert with the Navy, rather than being subordinate to the Navy. It is no accident that two important milestones happened within a year of each other to close this era: the final abolition of the traditional shipboard mission and the redesignation of the Fleet Marine Forces as the operating forces. Both changes signified a high degree of comfort on the part of the Marine Corps leaders that their service was now a full and essentially equal partner to the Navy in contributing to the national defense. Not long after the Marine Corps felt comfortable abandoning its most traditional role, opening the mature phase of its strategic relationship with the Navy, both services were tested. The events following September 11, 2001 certainly provided the Marine Corps with opportunities to showcase the MAGTF as a strategic response force projected forward from the sea. Most notable was Task Force 58 in Afghanistan. The global war on terror which followed brought unanticipated demand for the Corps to participate not only in major combat operations, but also sustained counterinsurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan. The long-term demands of these operations, far from the sea, led to an operational and cultural estrangement between the Navy and Marine Corps. Many Marines served a whole career during this era without ever spending time aboard ship, and Gator Navy officers spoke of amphibs going years without a single Marine aboard. Many came to regard the Corps' long identification with the Navy as nothing more than archaic tradition. The Corps' messaging shifted as well, further reflecting its confidence in its status as an equal partner to the Navy within the Joint Force. It branded itself the middleweight fighter of the Joint Force and America's expeditionary force in readiness. Combined with several other factors, this suggested a decline in Navy and Marine Corps relations. Marine forces came to be regarded more as a power projection option the Department of the Navy provided to the joint commanders, rather than a fleet asset. As a result, as the Navy focused its resources on core capabilities for blue water operations, the Marine Corps and its amphibious needs, such as sufficient amphibious lift and naval gunfire, suffered from less consistent support in the long term. An ongoing divergence widened between Marine Corps requirements for amphibious shipping and the size of the Gator Navy. In recent years, this has been exacerbated by severe problems with the material state of readiness of these ships, so that now even the 3MU construct is difficult to support. Competition with expansionist China and its growing naval power demand increased cooperation between the Navy and Marine Corps. Commandant General David Berger recognized this in 2019 and began a transformation of the Marine Corps to explicitly reshape the operating forces into a fleet marine force once again. Marines now work towards providing littoral combat forces armed with advanced systems ready to deny the use of the sea to our adversaries, an inherently naval mission. The progress that has been made thus far is a product of the Corps' willingness to make itself a supporting partner of the fleet once again. But this is being done from a position of much greater institutional security and self-confidence than was the case in the 1930s. While the Marine Corps has asserted itself as a partner in the joint force, the historic ties between the Navy and Marine Corps still do matter. Naval integration efforts leverage a mutual affinity that comes from the shared history of the sea services, builds upon mutual awareness and understanding, and enhances the potential for collaboration, unity of effort, and lethal synergy. If the Navy needs a partner who can operate ashore and help it fight at sea, it can accomplish much more with its Marine Corps than it ever could with the Army. The 250-year relationship between the U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Navy has defined the Corps throughout its entire history, first as a de facto subordinate component, but slowly evolving with the maturation of the Corps into a co-equal partner sea service and joint force provider in all respects. The way Marines have understood themselves has evolved significantly in parallel. Beginning as conflicted, subordinate others within, they are now supremely self-confident partners who hold themselves to be the premier warriors of the U.S. Naval Services. The long relationship between these two services also defined the Marine Corps' emergence as an expeditionary force in readiness. This began with a century of experience forward deployed as part of the crews of warships, led to a gradual specialization in the expeditionary landing force role, and ultimately justified claim to being the nation's expeditionary force in readiness. This is equally important to the Corps and its Marines for understanding who they are today.